Hey everyone, I'm Eduardo Norette. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time here, feel free to take a look around, watch some of my content. If there's anything you see that you want to give a like, some feedback, that would be great. And of course, if you can, subscribe to my channel. It really helps. For those of you who are coming back, welcome to episode 3 of my News Explained series. This is where I try to break down stories about once a week, give them a closer, more in-depth look, and give you information that the mainstream media hasn't. Maybe it's because of their own biases. Maybe it's because they run out of time. Maybe it's because they don't care about things that are important to the rest of you or important to my audience, and I want to give it a little bit more time that it deserves. So this week, I want to talk a little bit about my friend Tulsi Gabbard. She is up for her confirmation hearing this week in the United States Senate. President Trump has nominated her to be his director of national intelligence, and her road to confirmation looks like it's going to be one of the toughest among Trump's cabinet. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. She's a former Democrat. Now, I don't even think she's a Republican. She's just someone who shares President Trump's foreign policy vision and commitment to this country. So I want to get a little bit into the controversy around her selection, my relationship with her, and why I think she would be a great director of national intelligence. So I've known Tulsi a couple years now, and it's funny. I look back at my first time meeting her, and I can remember it very, very well. I was working for Tucker Carlson Tonight on Fox News, and Tucker had taken the day off, I guess. I can't exactly remember. And I had been assigned to fly out to Los Angeles to produce for and help Tulsi Gabbard guest host the show. So this was her first time guest hosting any show, I think, of that nature, a 1-hour show that was then the #1 show in cable news. I had always liked Tulsi from a distance. I had loved the views she had come to espouse on the channel. I mean, again, this was someone who was a Democrat, who had served this country, and who shared really a lot of different views than I had on maybe some domestic issues, but she had grown concerned at the growing national security and foreign policy establishment that continued to have a grip on our country's decision-making despite decades and decades of errors and mistakes. And you can go on anything from, domestic surveillance of American citizens that violate due process. You can talk about the regime change wars in the Middle East. Tulsi has been outspoken on those things for a number of years, and I had been a supporter of that. I remember her being extremely humble, and something that I recall from that meeting pretty early on was the way that she really was trying to pick my brain on what goes into hosting the show, what I thought, made Tucker so successful in what he did. She asked me questions about who else I had worked with and kind of from a producer's perspective, what we looked for in a guest host. What could she do to make my job easier? What bits of advice that I had. This was someone who came into the meeting and came from a perspective of admitting that she didn't know what she didn't know, and this was a new experience for her, and that she genuinely wanted to know from me. And I was just a producer. I mean, talk about someone who's accomplished much more at that phase in her life than I had. That kind of blew me away. I mean, she's done a lot of TV appearances before. This is someone who's shared presidential debate stages. It's not like she was new to TV. So anyways, I thought that was pretty telling. She was someone who expressed an interest in wanting to learn and wanting to do a good job. So great. I remember getting to the studio. She had kind of politely asked me if she could take a look at some of the scripts beforehand, because I wasn't just producing for her. I was writing the opening monologue as well as some of the other scripts in the show as well. So I remember coordinating with her on the scripts, and basically you're thrown onto this set. She's got hair and makeup people, she's got lighting people, there's producers and technical people running back and forth. And I remember we were kind of being pushed up on a deadline in terms of getting these scripts turned around. But I remember, she kicked off the show really well. The opening monologue went smoothly. And I remember in that first commercial break, she asked me how she was doing. And you could really tell, at least from where I was standing from my vantage point as a TV producer, that she really eased into the role and got comfortable throughout. And it was a great show. Another thing I remember was after the show ended, there were people going up to her, congratulating her. She was kind of talking to some of the staff, and some of the guests who she had invited on the show as well seemed to be personal friends with her, so she was talking to them. But she kind of made a point to call me over. She wanted to thank me for helping her host the show. She asked if we could get a photo together. She wanted to get a photo with all of the behind-the-scenes folks who do the cameras and the lights and the audio and all that stuff. So I left my day and a half, 2 days with her thinking, wow, this is a really genuinely nice, sincere person who not only believes what she says, but practice what she preaches. I mean, is truly kind to everyone. So about a year later, a year and a half later, Tucker gets fired from Fox News. It was a really tumultuous period for those of us who worked on the show. We didn't really know what our futures looked like. A lot of us, like everybody else in the world, you have bills to pay, you have rent to pay. And so all of a sudden, from one day to the next with no notice, you're faced with, am I going to lose my job? What am I going to do? And I remember her reaching out to me and again, expressing sincere concern for what was going on. Was there anything she could do? I think she offered to call me a couple days later just to kind of see what I was going to do next. And I remember having a lengthy conversation with her. I said, look, I don't think we've ever talked about this. It's always been my interest to work in media and be in front of the camera. Here's where I thought my path was going to go had I stayed at Fox News. And now that they've kind of told us that it's the end of the road for us, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is what my interest would be. And immediately, without even second guessing herself, she talked to me about an opportunity that she wanted to work with me on. She said, look, this is kind of in the very early phases, but I've been talking with the folks at X. I think at the time Elon Musk had just purchased the platform maybe a couple of months before, if that. And she said they want to start putting out their own original content on the platform. They want me to do a show or some type of series with them. And we're still trying to conceptualize it. It's maybe going to be a little documentary style in some ways. In other ways, it's going to be sort of some news and analysis. But I really loved working with you, and I'd love for you to come join me in this opportunity. And, we'll find some ways to get you on air and on camera if that's, really what you want to do. And, of course, I immediately, Tulsi Gabbard wants to work with you. Again, she has such a record of success in her field, in her industry, and building a movement and an audience of supporters because people really believe in her message. If there's a way I could play a part of that, of course. So again, that opened up a new level in our friendship and our working relationship over the next year, where I worked with her to conceptualize and push the launch of her X show, what ended up being called Tulsi X Truth. So there were a lot of conversations. She was doing a lot of things at the time too. I mean, she was still a contributor at Fox News. I think she had a book coming out. She had a podcast at the time. So we weren't able to launch, as quickly as, I would have liked at that time. But I was happy to be a part in the show's launch for her and conceptualizing what the show was going to be like. We ended up putting a couple episodes together. And then she goes through this political transformation where she leaves the Democrat Party. She then a couple months later ends up endorsing Donald Trump, and she's flung onto the campaign trail. So the show sort of takes a back seat, I think rightfully so. And she starts doing everything in her power to get Donald Trump elected. Fast forward to where we are today, where he wins the election and he decides he wants to nominate her as his director of national intelligence. And so the one thing I'll say about my whole experience knowing Tulsi that I think is relevant in all of this is whether it was working on Tucker's show or whether it was working on her own show, Tulsi X Truth, there were a couple things that she brought to the table and put the traditional, boxes of qualifications aside, right? Because people are always going to debate those resume qualifications. And Tulsi obviously has those. She was a member of Congress. She enlisted to serve in the military and has served in the Army National Guard for over 20 years. She was motivated to serve this country after 9/11, to fight and defend our country. She put her life on the line for this country. So putting all those qualifications aside, which she obviously has, there's some intangible qualities, some unique qualities she brings that we haven't quite seen in the national security and foreign policy establishment for quite some time. What do I mean by that? Well, yes, there have been a lot of people who have served as national security advisor, served in the Pentagon, in our intelligence agencies over the last several decades who also have the qualifications. I mean, maybe they went through the State Department. Maybe they have spent their careers rising the ranks at the FBI or the CIA or, again, at any other of the intelligence agencies. But I think Tulsi's experience unique is that she doesn't come from those institutions, which for better or for worse, there's good experience and there's bad experience. And I think we have enough evidence of American foreign policy and national security decision-making over the last 20 years to know that whatever qualifications these people have had, it's not often yielded great results. I mean, we've seen a lot of disasters in the Middle East, from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. We've seen so-called intelligence, like being told that there were weapons of mass destruction when there in fact were not. Different things like this. And so I think when you're entrenched in that world, when you come from these institutions, you have a tendency to defend the institution, gatekeep. You feel a sense of needing to protect the institution, even when these institutions have made obvious mistakes, and costly mistakes, by the way, mistakes that have cost the American taxpayer trillions of dollars, mistakes that have cost thousands of American lives overseas, and untold numbers of civilian deaths overseas as well. And so people have tried to use this aspect of Tulsi's experience against her, that she doesn't have the quote-unquote Washington experience in these institutions, but I actually think that works in her favor. She's not part of that monolithic orthodoxy in her way of thinking. And number two, something I think she brings to the table that, okay, I can't maybe speak to these individuals who come before her. I can only guess based on the track record. But when I worked with her, every time, and I think this is valid when you're considering national intelligence, she always wanted to get the story right. She was so concerned with what the truth was, what the accurate information was. Could we back up what we were saying? Where were we getting this information from? Where were we getting these claims that we were making in her content or on the air? I think that's important. She cares about the truth. She's courageous. She wasn't afraid to touch stories that were risky, that criticized power. I mean, even when we did a Quiet Skies episode earlier last year, the Quiet Skies being TSA's, the Transportation Security Administration's surveillance program, where they surveil and subject certain Americans to stringent security policies at airports. They basically put you on a terror list. And last year, a day after criticizing Kamala Harris on Fox News, Tulsi found herself on that list. And instead of keeping it quiet and saying, let me go through the back channels to find out what went on here, she was very vocal about talking about what had happened to herself, about criticizing the power structures that had done this to her. And she also did it at the same time while wanting to make sure she got the facts straight. She didn't want to go out there and make sweeping, sensationalized claims about her country. She wanted to speak from an honest perspective about what had happened to her, why it was important, and why it was important to change, how wrong this was. So I saw that aspect of her. I saw an aspect of her which you don't often see this in American foreign policy and national security circles. When you look at the think tank world, these people who go from their long careers in Washington to then having MSNBC and CNN contributor gigs. But Tulsi was very knowing of the fact that our intelligence agencies are not omniscient. They're not all-knowing. We don't know everything. We don't, there's a lot that we don't know out there. She knew that there are real world consequences to American foreign policy that sometimes we're not going to be able to predict, despite what the intelligence agencies say. I mean, look at Libya and Syria, where the intelligence agencies told members of Congress that, if you just get rid of Gaddafi, you're going to be able to create this wonderful democracy in North Africa and the Middle East. It's just going to be great for the people of Libya. That's what our intelligence community said. And so what happened? We get rid of Gaddafi, and now Libya, there are actual slaves being sold on the streets of Libya in the 21st century. There is modern-day slavery going on. It isn't even a country. And so she, bringing a different perspective to that, understands that they're not always right, and that sometimes we are wrong, and that sometimes things are going to happen that we can't predict. And lastly, she knows that our decisions put American soldiers at real risk. It's not a game. It's not a game to say, let's invade this country, or let's do that, or because we're the United States, we're the most powerful military in the world, nothing's going to happen. On the contrary, she knows because she served, and she served with brothers and sisters in uniform that she has seen get harmed by these policies. She has seen the effects that war has had on these people. She knows that the decision-making and the intelligence gathering and what that leads to has very real consequences. And I think that's important. There's so much about Washington, whether it's at the domestic level or the foreign level, where our leaders think they know everything. They think they have all the answers. They think because we're the United States, we can make no mistakes. And that's not true. We've seen what some of those things are. And so in the last few weeks, it's been pretty disgusting to see Tulsi smeared on a number of fronts. She's been smeared for having heterodox views about things. By the way, from the very same experts and careerists and qualified people, as I mentioned before, who supported all of those terrible things, Iraq, Afghanistan, those wars, those nation-building campaigns in Libya. So the same people who thought that was a good idea are attacking Tulsi for her ideas and for bringing something different to the table. The other thing that she's coming under fire for is some comments that two other actual real-world examples. Number one is some comments she made about the existence of biolabs in Ukraine during the Ukraine war. So the media did an interesting twist here where a couple of responsible conservative commentators, one of them being my former boss, Tucker Carlson, Tulsi was one of these, and several others, pointed out the obvious fact that there were several U.S. funded, in other words, we spent money on these biolabs every single year, U.S. funded biolabs in Ukraine that were conducting research and trying to break down and secure deadly pathogens that were remnants of the Soviet era. And by the way, this is not some fringe conspiracy that Tucker made up or that the right wing made up. President Obama, when he was a senator running for the presidency in 2007, talked about visiting a Ukrainian biolab in 2005, and he saw firsthand the pathogens they had at this site. In fact, he was quite, according to some reports, sort of terrified by them. Take a listen.
I also know what I've found in my travels over the past 2 years. In an old building in Ukraine, I saw test tubes filled with anthrax and the plague lying virtually unlocked and unguarded. Dangers, we were told, could only be secured with America's help.
Tulsi's allegations on this issue were always very clear. She talked about biolabs, she talked about the dangers, and she pointed out the obvious fact that, okay, the American people didn't know that our tax dollars were going to more laboratories around the world that have deadly pathogens. Again, this is right after COVID. So A, we deserve some answers about what's going on here. We don't want this to happen again. And number two, this is in a war zone. So what is the Biden administration doing to secure these labs? That's all. That's the controversy here. And for saying that, for commenting on something that was in the news, she has been smeared and disgustingly accused of spreading Russian propaganda, spreading foreign attacks against this country. I mean, this is someone who risked her life and has risked her life multiple times. It's not just once by enlisting. She has risked her life to go serve this country in uniform. She has seen her own brothers and sisters in uniform suffer and die fighting for this country. And now she's going to have some Washington hack who sits behind a desk accuse her of treason, really. I mean, that is the purpose of saying you're spreading Russian talking points, is that you're a puppet for a foreign government that is not your own. It's beyond disgusting, and I think it's wrong, and it's all over this biolab story. The last story that we saw was on Syria, and so they brought it back up again because Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator who ruled that country for decades before he was just deposed a couple of weeks ago, Tulsi had spoken out over the years about the danger in getting rid of Assad because of what the alternative was. And so we are now seeing what the alternative is. Nobody is saying Bashar al-Assad is a good guy. Nobody was saying he's just this wonderful, benevolent leader. But you can't, as we've seen in many other countries, Iraq, Libya, you can't just get rid of a strong man and think that democracy is going to flourish immediately the next day. And in fact, the point she was trying to make in Syria was, if we get rid of Assad, what you may see happen in that country is violent terror groups like Al-Qaeda, again, the one, that did 9/11, the terror group that did 9/11 that, I fought to enlist and fight against. This is Tulsi Gabbard saying this. That very same Al-Qaeda may take control, may be able to spread. ISIS may gain control. You may allow some of these communities in Syria, which, again, nobody's saying they're living a perfect life under Assad, but there is such a thing as getting worse. I mean, things can always get worse. And do we want to allow these people, these Christian minorities, these religious minorities, to fall under terrorist rule? Do we want them to go from living in a government that maybe they don't have all the freedoms we have in the United States, but they at least have their own religious freedoms, or they were allowed to practice a religion, being, in a majority Muslim country, do we want these people to now live under a literal terrorist group? So she'd been saying that for years. And when she was a member of Congress, she goes to take a trip to Syria. And she says, I've never talked to her about this. I really don't care, in the sense that I think it's the duty of every elected official to obtain the information they see fit to make the best decision on behalf of the American people. And I think she went to Syria in 2011 or 2012. This was at the height or the very beginning of the Syrian civil war, when the war drum is beating here in the United States for more regime change. Let's do to Syria what we did to Iraq, what we did to Afghanistan, which now many years on, it's very obvious that would have been terrible, not just for Syria, but also for the United States. And as we learned later as well, President Obama had authorized the CIA to overthrow the government. President Obama had spent $500 million trying to train so-called moderate Syrian rebels, $500 million training just a handful of soldiers. Some of the people we armed, whether deliberately or inadvertently, that can be debated. But some of the people we sent arms to ended up being ISIS terrorists, radical Islamist terrorists. And so throughout all of this, there are people warning that this could happen. It's not like we didn't think this could happen. I mean, some people were smart enough to have learned our lesson from years past, and Tulsi was one of them. So she gets invited on a trip to go to the Middle East, to go to Lebanon, to go to Syria, to see for herself what's happening there. I mean, again, just as Congress is talking about maybe even giving war powers to the president over this. So she goes to Syria, and according to the reporting, once she is there, she is given the opportunity to meet with Syrian President Assad. She meets with him. She comes home, she continues to advocate against war in the region, against overthrowing his government. Then a couple years later, when some people want to make an issue of it, she says he is, of course, a dictator. But what I was concerned about is seeing the situation on the ground and making sure that, what we were doing here wasn't going to allow more Islamic terrorism to spread. Isn't that the whole reason why we were in the Middle East in the first place? That was Tulsi's argument. That was always her argument. And anyways, people have just grossly used that moment to say, oh, she met with a dictator, she loves dictators, or she's a foreign asset, as if meeting with the leader of another country, as if meeting with a foreign head of state, maybe from a country that doesn't have the same freedoms as we do, is somehow criminal. Because if that's the case, Obama is guilty of that, Bill Clinton is guilty of that, George W. Bush is guilty of that, the media is guilty of that. I mean, they're members of the media. I think Barbara Walters interviewed Saddam Hussein, Fidel Castro. So if the standard is, some people in the media have interviewed Putin. So if the standard is, oh, you can't even meet with an adversary or someone who has nuclear weapons or someone who is a regional player, because then you're complicit in everything they're doing, that's absurd. How would we ever get regional diplomatic agreements? How would we ever conduct foreign policy if you were only allowed to talk to countries that shared your views? It would never work. And so it's just also fake. Nancy Pelosi has met with Assad. John Kerry met with Assad multiple times. There's this famous photo of him dining with Assad. And so nobody cares about the fact that those people meet with Assad, because those people adopted the right and the approved foreign policy views when the time mattered. So when the time comes, Nancy Pelosi can always be counted on to vote for a regime change war. Same thing with John Kerry. Same thing with George Bush and Obama. When it mattered most, they could be relied upon by the national intelligence and foreign policy establishments to support regime change. That's why it's okay for all of those people to meet with dictators or to meet with leaders in bad countries. It only matters, they only care about it when you're someone like a Tulsi who meets with these people and then doesn't want to overthrow them the way that our national security and foreign policy establishment does. She's not endorsing Bashar Assad. She was trying to find out what was going on there. And I believe, again, I've never talked to her about this. I never would. I'm not interested in it. But I think she was doing her duty as a member of Congress to inform herself of the situation before she voted to send maybe billions in taxpayer dollars to fighting another war. Maybe she wanted to know more about it before she sent thousands of Americans to go, sons and daughters, to go get killed in a conflict that we had no business being involved in. And so is that such a crime? Is that such a crime to, again, as an elected official, to do your duty and represent your constituents by getting information? In fact, I think it's not talking to our adversaries that is what is so dangerous. Joe Biden, in the midst of the Ukraine and Russia war the last few years, his administration essentially cut off all communication with Russia. He reportedly was not talking to Putin. His Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was not speaking to the Russians. And even at the height of the Cold War, even at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy was talking to the Russian Premier, Nikita Khrushchev. They kept an open line of communication because they knew that these are two powers with nuclear weapons that couldn't afford not to. That despite how high the tensions were, you couldn't afford just to not talk to an adversary of that level of threat. And so part of the reason why we're still in this war is because of people like Joe Biden refusing to meet or talk with Putin. Instead, he continues to add sanctions from far away. He has continued to ramp up the war rhetoric that has continued to push Putin further and further into an international corner of his own. And so anyways, there's so much you could get into more in depth about this, but what it comes down to is it's not about the fact that she met with Bashar al-Assad. It's that she was one of the few lone voices who smartly said and correctly predicted that if we overthrow him, as most of Washington wants to do, the country will fall into the hands of terrorists. And by the way, that's exactly what happened. The current head of the country, this guy, Jalani, was a former member of Al-Qaeda. So there you have it. She wasn't wrong to warn about that. The last thing I'll say about these people who want to disgracefully question Tulsi's loyalty and want to smear her ahead of her confirmation hearing, these people like former CIA Director John Brennan, former NSA Chief James Clapper, any of these national security officials who have disgraced themselves, actually, based off their record of lies. Let's go through that, okay? So we're supposed to, on MSNBC, they uphold John Brennan as some arbiter of what the national security establishment should be, what the Director of National Intelligence should look like and should talk like, and what views they're allowed to have. Okay, this is a guy who lied under oath to Congress. He was using the CIA to spy on senators and their staffers for daring to conduct their constitutional responsibility of oversight on the intelligence agencies. So for overseeing the intelligence agencies, he was turning what an agency, the CIA, that is supposed to spy on foreign entities to keep Americans safe, he turned the CIA on Senate staffers and United States senators. How chilling is that? And not only did he do that, but he lied about it under oath. He perjured himself, which is a felony, punishable by jail time. And did John Brennan go to jail? Was John Brennan punished for lying under oath? Was he punished for spying on Senate staffers? No, instead, he gets elevated with an MSNBC contract. Same thing for Jim Clapper. He lied to Congress about the NSA's domestic surveillance of American citizens. Are these the types of national security and intelligence officials we should be upholding for positions like Director of National Intelligence? I mean, do these Republican senators who are, I guess, on the fence about voting for Tulsi, do they think we would be better served by selecting some deep state, careerist, institutional hack who doesn't care about being honest with the American people, who doesn't care about restoring public trust in these institutions after guys like Brennan, Clapper, Comey, and many others, the 51 former intelligence officials who lied and politicized intelligence, pushed false intelligence for politics so that their preferred candidate could win an election against Donald Trump in 2020? Do they think choosing one of those guys would be better than choosing someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who is an honest broker, someone who would be honest and would not politicize intelligence? Because that's almost like the argument they're making. They want someone with experience. They want someone who's experienced and who's gone through the system. Again, these guys are going to protect the institution. They're not going to be honest with Congress. They're not going to be honest with the American people. And there's a reason why the American people have record low faith in their institutions. Nobody trusts the FBI. Nobody trusts the CIA. Nobody trusts the NSA anymore. These institutions have degraded themselves. And I believe Tulsi can restore that public trust because, again, she's not here to politicize intelligence. She's not here to pick and choose what intelligence she's going to show to the president based on what her views are. I believe her when she says she's sincerely and only interested in the truth. I think there's going to be times when she gets information and she's going to feel confident in telling President Trump, we know that X, Y, and Z is definitely happening because of the intelligence gathering methods here. And I think conversely, there's other times where she's not going to be afraid to tell the president that there is doubt in some of the information that we may be getting from our intelligence agencies, maybe because the gathering methods are suspect or because we just can't be sure. And what I am sure she's not going to do is do what so many of these guys, so many of these intelligence hacks, these career establishment deep state types have done for the last few administrations, which is cherry pick information to get the desired outcome that they want from the president. In other words, let's give the president selective information. Let's give the American public selected information. Let's lie about President Trump's, for example, communications with the Russian government while he's running for president, which was a total lie, so that we can get the desired outcome we want of being able to wiretap and spy on his campaign. That's what she's not going to do. She's not going to frame intelligence to yield a political outcome. I say all of this as someone who doesn't even work for Tulsi Gabbard right now, who doesn't even pretend to speak for her. I don't. I mean, in fact, I don't even think I've had a private conversation with her about what her views are or why she believes the things she believes in. And that's mainly because she's always been an open book. In other words, the views and the issues and the policies she conveys publicly on her social media accounts or on television is always what I've understood to be the views that she holds privately. I mean, there's never been any other discussion. So I think this idea, again, being pushed in the media that she's got some ulterior motives, that her views are fringe, is actually quite gross. Tulsi is transparent. Her views are out there in the open. If you disagree with those views, which is totally in the right of the media, it's totally in the right of anyone to disagree with Tulsi Gabbard's views, explain clearly why you think she's wrong and what your views are instead. But if you notice, they won't do that. They won't go through and explain why they think Tulsi's view on XYZ issue is incorrect. Instead, they smear, they lie, they misrepresent what her views are, and they even go as far as to accuse her of things like treason, which, by the way, for those who are paying attention, is a crime punishable by death. So they won't engage Tulsi in the ideas, they just say she's some Russian who deserves to be killed for having her views. Again, they say this of someone who enlisted to fight and serve her country. It is of the lowest of the low types of smears you see in our politics. And you can tell that these people are insecure and weak in their own viewpoint because they won't even challenge her. If they were so sure that their views were the right ones or their views were the correct ones, it'd be pretty easy, you would think, for them to put their views out there and challenge Tulsi on any of her views. But they won't do that. And so last thing I'll say, I could never pretend to speak or to know what Tulsi's going to do as Director of National Intelligence. I can only, as I've tried to explain in this episode here, speak to her character as far as to the extent that which I experienced it in knowing her these last few years, both at a personal level and also working with her. And what I can tell you is this: if you've learned anything from the last, 20, 30 minutes of this episode, it's this, is that Tulsi's an honest broker. She cares about the truth. She's going to wait on commenting on something until she knows what that truth is. She's not afraid to challenge difficult subjects. She's courageous in wanting to show the facts, reveal the facts to the American public. She cares about faith in our institutions because she knows in order to keep us safe, these institutions are vital. And if the American public can't trust in these institutions, then that job becomes so much harder. And I think what we've all seen about her career over the last few years is that she's not interested in partisan politics. I am sure there's a ton of issues that she and Trump disagree on. But I think what is reassuring about the fact that they are working together, and just from my experience with her and what we've all seen in her public career over the last few years, is she's going to have that courage to stand up and say when she thinks he's right, when she thinks he's wrong, and she's going to have that judgment about our intelligence too. This is going to be a reckoning for the intelligence community that has so failed the American public for the last few decades, and we should all be here to support it. If any senator wants to vote against her on the issues, they should make those positions clear. But again, to attack her character, to attack her record of service is shameful, and it's really beneath the United States Senate. So I'm hoping the senators will confirm her this week, and I know she would be a great director of national intelligence. All right, thanks so much for watching my explainer this week on my relationship and friendship with Tulsi Gabbard. Call your senators to vote for her. If you know of a senator in your state who is on the fence about voting for her, call them and let them know. President Trump has a mandate to enact his agenda. It is their responsibility to support that agenda, and failure to do so will have consequences for them electorally. President Trump won a majority of the electoral and the popular vote. The American people have spoken, and so anyone who's trying to get in the way of that at this point is obstructing. So let them know. And always, of course, feel free to give this video a like and my channel a subscribe. We'll see you next time.